It was a crowded afternoon on the subway. The air buzzed with the typical chaos of people rushing to get to their destinations. But amidst the bustle, a quiet tension lingered, like a storm cloud hovering over the moment, just waiting to burst. Jada, a bright, ambitious young woman, had been on her feet all day. The job interview she had just finished had drained every last ounce of energy she had. All she wanted now was to get home, put her feet up, and relax. She stepped onto the subway car, scanning the crowded seats. As usual, the train was packed, with barely any empty spaces to be found. Her eyes landed on an empty spot by the window, a seat that seemed like a small slice of paradise in the middle of the chaos. The only problem? The woman sitting next to it, a middle-aged lady dressed in a business suit, had her purse sprawled across the seat next to her, clearly claiming it as hers. Jada hesitated for a moment. She had every right to sit there, but she had also seen this kind of situation before. In the past, she had been forced to squeeze into corners or stand just to avoid the uncomfortable confrontations that sometimes arose when people didn't want to share space. But today she was too tired to care. As Jada made her way toward the seat, she gently nudged the woman's purse aside, ready to sit down. The woman's eyes flickered up to meet hers, and for a brief moment, Jada saw something cold in them, something unspoken. The woman pulled her purse back with a swift motion and shot Jada a glare. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with a tone that wasn't just about ownership of the seat, but something more. Jada paused, her hand still hovering over the seat. There it was, the microaggression she had learned to recognize over the years. The woman's posture stiffened, her body language speaking volumes more than her words ever could. It was clear she didn't want Jada to sit down, not because there was no space, but because of who Jada was. "I don't think that seat is available for you," the woman continued, her words coated with thinly veiled prejudice. "There are other spots on the train." Jada's heart sank, the familiar sting of rejection gnawing at her. She wanted to speak up, to say something that would shut the woman down, but she held back. She wasn't in the mood to fight. Instead, she glanced around the crowded car, hoping for some form of support, but it was as if the world had turned a blind eye. The people sitting around her pretended not to notice, lost in their own worlds. But Jada wasn't about to give in. With a quiet resolve, she gently set her bag down, moving her hand back toward the seat. "It's just a seat," she said softly. "I'm not here to cause trouble." The woman scoffed, a smug smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You know, you people should know your place." The words hit Jada like a punch to the stomach, leaving her breathless for a second. She had heard it all before, but hearing it again, being so blatantly discriminated against, it still stung. Jada stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of her wanted to get off the train, to walk away from this, but another part of her was fed up. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect, dignity, and standing up to the cruelty that people like this woman thought they could get away with. Just as Jada was about to say something, to defend herself, something strange happened. A sudden chill seemed to fill the air. The lights on the train flickered, and the woman's confident posture faltered. Her eyes widened as if something had caught her off guard. She glanced around nervously, her eyes darting to the people seated nearby. The air seemed to thicken, the tension escalating as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. But then, the impossible occurred. The woman's purse, still on the seat next to her, shifted. It wasn't a breeze or a bump. No, this was deliberate. The purse moved on its own, sliding across the seat and landing on the floor with a thud. The woman's eyes bulged in shock. She stared at the purse, then back at Jada, her face paling as the realization hit her. Something was wrong. Jada didn't know what had just happened, but she wasn't going to let this moment slip away. The tables had turned, and whatever karma was in store for this woman was just beginning to unfold. As the woman's panic began to rise, Jada took her seat, feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction wash over her. But this was just the beginning of the story. Little did she know the strange events that followed would not only change her day, but leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about justice, karma, and the world around her. Stay tuned to find out how this seemingly small act of resistance led to a chain of events that no one saw coming, where the line between right and wrong blurs, and the world reveals its own unexpected way of balancing the scales. The moment Jada sat down, the tension in the air felt like it could be cut with a knife. She noticed the woman staring at her, her face a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. The purse, which had seemed so firmly planted moments ago, now lay on the floor, its contents spilling out across the train floor. A small wallet, a phone, and some loose change scattered, as if the purse itself had somehow just given up its place of pride. The woman's hands trembled as she hastily scooped her belongings back into her bag, her eyes not leaving Jada. It was almost as if she couldn't believe what was happening, like the world around her had tilted slightly off its axis. Jada could feel her own heart racing, not from fear, but from the strange sense of power that had washed over her. For once, she wasn't the one who had to shrink or apologize. The roles had reversed, and she wasn't entirely sure how. She glanced around the train again, noticing the other passengers. Most were avoiding eye contact, pretending that they hadn't seen the exchange as they usually did. But one man, seated near the door at the far end of the car, had been watching the scene unfold. His gaze flickered between Jada and the woman, an expression on his face that was almost knowing. She couldn't place it, but there was something about his demeanor that suggested he wasn't surprised by what had just happened. It was as if he had seen this kind of thing before, but there was no way to tell for sure. The man didn't speak, but he caught Jada's eye for a brief moment before quickly looking away. Jada shook off the unsettling feeling that crept up her spine. She had a long ride ahead of her, and all she wanted to do was get home. She tried to focus on the rhythmic motion of the train, the clattering sound of the tracks below, and the soft murmur of conversation around her. But the tension in the air was suffocating. It was clear the woman was still stewing, her every movement tense, as though she was preparing for something she didn't quite understand. A few stops passed in silence, the woman's restless energy growing by the minute. Jada could feel her glare even without turning her head. The feeling of being watched was palpable. It was as if the woman was waiting for Jada to make a mistake, to give her a reason to escalate the confrontation. But Jada remained calm, staring straight ahead. Her fingers lightly gripped her bag, but she kept herself steady. She wasn't going to let this woman get under her skin. Not today. Just as Jada thought the moment might pass, the woman finally spoke again, her voice dripping with venom. "You're so bold, aren't you?" she said, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "No shame at all." Jada felt a flicker of anger rise, but she kept her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied coolly, her voice even, trying to hold back the sting of the insult. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean," the woman snapped, leaning forward in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "You think just because you got a seat now, everything is fine. You think that's enough to make you better than me?" Jada's pulse quickened, but she didn't answer immediately. She wanted to push back, to say something that would shut this woman down once and for all. But there was something in the way the woman was acting, like she was baiting her, like she wanted a confrontation, needed it to feel superior. Jada wasn't about to give her that satisfaction, so she leaned back in her seat, glancing briefly at the man near the door again. He was still watching, still silent, his expression unreadable. "Look," Jada said after a long pause, her voice low but firm, "I'm not here to fight with you. I just need to sit down. If you're so bothered by it, why don't you move to another seat?" The woman's face flushed a deep red. Her hands clenched into fists, and for a second, Jada thought she might explode. But instead, the woman turned away, her body stiff with indignation. She muttered something under her breath that Jada couldn't quite hear, and the tension between them seemed to grow even thicker. The train car was small, the air heavy with unspoken animosity, and Jada was beginning to feel like the walls were closing in. But just as quickly as it had started, the woman fell silent. She turned her head away, staring out the window, her face a mix of confusion and frustration. Jada let out a breath, relieved for the brief respite. The last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation further. She had dealt with enough hate and negativity in her life. She wasn't interested in making a scene over something as trivial as a seat on a subway. But the sense that something wasn't right lingered. There was a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sensation that told her this wasn't over. She had faced prejudice before, subtle, overt, and everything in between. But there was something different about this woman. It was as if she were pushing Jada, testing her in ways she couldn't quite understand. The subway car rumbled as it approached another stop, but Jada didn't look up from her seat. Instead, she focused on the floor, feeling the vibrations of the train beneath her feet. The air still felt thick, but she was no longer sure if it was just the remnants of their confrontation or something more. It was like the whole train was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the doors opened and new passengers poured in, Jada's mind wandered, but not far. She couldn't shake the feeling that this woman wasn't just some random stranger. Something about her, the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, reminded Jada of something or someone. It was like she had seen this type of person before, but in a different setting, a different life. The train filled up again, the noise of the crowd growing louder, but Jada barely noticed. She was too focused on the uneasy tension that seemed to have followed her, creeping into every corner of the car. The woman's face was still turned toward the window, her expression unreadable, but Jada could sense that the storm wasn't over yet. It was building, slowly, almost imperceptibly. And as the train carried them further into the city, Jada couldn't help but wonder just how far this woman was willing to push her before the storm finally broke. As the train swayed with its rhythmic motion, the din of chatter seemed to fade into the background, and Jada couldn't help but notice how isolated she felt despite the crowd around her. The woman still sat a few feet away, her presence like a heavy shadow in the corner of Jada's vision. The silence between them now felt more charged, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. Jada's thoughts raced, but she wasn't sure where they were leading her. What was about this woman? Why did she feel the need to lash out at someone just trying to go about their day? Jada had seen prejudice before. She had dealt with it for years, faced it in classrooms, workplaces, and even on the streets. But this woman, with her fragile air of superiority, felt different. There was something more personal about this encounter, something that didn't sit right. Her eyes flicked back to the man by the door again. He was still watching. Not staring directly, but his gaze was steady, and she could almost feel his awareness of the undercurrent of discomfort in the train car. The fact that he hadn't intervened or even spoken up made Jada wonder about the culture of bystanders in this city. Was this just another case of people turning a blind eye, unwilling to get involved, or was it something else? Before she could dwell on it further, a voice from a few seats down broke the silence. A woman, maybe in her mid-30s, leaned forward, her eyes flicking from Jada to the woman across from her. "Don't you just love how some people think they can take over everything?" The woman muttered, her tone laced with judgment, loud enough for everyone to hear. She was sitting with a group of friends, all of whom seemed to nod in agreement. Jada's stomach turned. The woman in the seat next to Jada was one of those passive-aggressive types, the kind who pretended to not notice, but in reality used the subtle weight of their words to fuel the fire. Jada could feel the underlying support that seemed to surround the woman across from her. As if on cue, the woman herself stirred, shifting in her seat, finally turning back to face Jada after what seemed like an eternity of staring out the window. "Is there something wrong with me sitting here?" Jada asked, her voice quiet but firm, a calmness in her words that contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling inside her. She wanted to understand, why was she being singled out? What was the real issue here? Was it the seat, or was it her? The woman didn't respond immediately. She looked at Jada, her eyes flashing, but then her gaze shifted, and Jada could see the conflict brewing inside her. Was she really just angry because a black girl had dared to sit down in front of her? Or was there something more at play here? Jada wasn't sure, but she could sense that whatever it was deep, hidden beneath layers of resentment. It was then that the man near the door stood up and slowly walked over to the woman. His movements were deliberate, as if he was weighing each step carefully. He reached her side and stood there for a few moments, as though unsure what to say. Jada couldn't believe her eyes. What was this guy doing? Was he about to escalate the situation even more? "I think you should apologize," he said, his voice calm yet stern. His words were directed at the woman, but he glanced briefly at Jada, as if to reassure her that she wasn't alone. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of something unspoken. Jada could feel a rush of gratitude, though the situation was far from over. The woman's eyes widened, and for a moment, her composure seemed to shatter. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again as though considering her next words carefully. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, but no one spoke. Even the group of passengers nearby fell into an uneasy quiet. Finally, the woman turned her gaze to the man, her expression defensive. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" She sneered, her voice sharp. "This doesn't concern you." "I think it does," the man replied, his voice unwavering. He looked down at Jada, his expression softening just a fraction. "I've seen this kind of thing happen before. I think you owe her an apology." For a moment, Jada couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or more tense. The man was on her side, but that didn't necessarily mean the situation was over. The woman was clearly stubborn and unwilling to back down easily. It was like a standoff, but one that was happening in the middle of a public space with all eyes on them. The woman, her hands still trembling, turned back to Jada. "I don't owe you anything," she spat, her face contorted in disgust. "You think you can just take what's mine? You think I'll just let you sit here like you belong?" The words cut through the air like a whip, and Jada's blood ran cold. There it was, the deep-seated venom that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. This wasn't about a seat on the train. This was about something far more ingrained. A fear of being invaded, of losing a place in the world that she believed was hers by right. Jada's chest tightened. She had faced racism before, but this was something different. The woman wasn't just angry about her presence. She was terrified of it. Terrified of being challenged, of having her own space encroached upon by someone she thought was beneath her. The ugliness of it was palpable, and Jada knew that there was no easy way to solve it. But the man wasn't finished. He stood his ground. "You know," he said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority, "I've seen a lot of things in my time. People like you, people like her, all trying to prove something, trying to make others feel small so they can feel big. It never works. Not in the long run." Jada's eyes flicked between them. The woman's face had turned a shade paler, and Jada could almost see the wheels turning in her head, the panic creeping in. "You don't know me," the woman muttered, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't understand what it's like." "Actually," the man said, stepping even closer to her, "I think I understand more than you think." For a moment, the train car was silent, the atmosphere thick with tension. Jada's mind raced, but she couldn't keep up. What was going to happen next? How would this all play out? Would the woman back down, or would she escalate the confrontation further? And what would the man do next? He seemed to be getting through to her, but something in Jada's gut told her that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot.